Hello, everybody, and welcome to another Thriving Thursday. I'm Carla. I'm a former management consultant turned full-time RV nomad and career and life coach here at Vida Canvas. And on Thursdays, we talk about tips and reflections for better living and for career empowerment, while I broadcast from some beautiful spot where we are currently living in the moment. And today I'm broadcasting from Wyoming, from outside the Teton mountain range. And I honestly wanted to broadcast from outside because I want to show you these views, not to boast, but really just to share this beautiful nature that can create so much peace inside of us. Unfortunately, wind really picked up today. And so I knew that, the wind was just going to get in the way of the broadcast. So instead, I thought I'd show you just a quick photo of where I am. Hopefully you can see that right there. That's our little casita where we live. So I'm broadcasting from inside the casita, but that mountain range is definitely the view that we have. I'll definitely keep trying to broadcast from outside whenever possible. Before I jump into today's topic, I want to give a shout out to my brother and sister-in-law, Lily and Jake, who let me know this morning that they tune in every Thursdays to Thriving Thursdays, and they don't tune in live, but they join the recording later on when they get home after work. And so I just want to say hello and welcome, and I'm just so thrilled and honored to have you guys join. So for today, I want to touch on a topic that I started to talk about last week, which is the concept of taking action. And last week we talked about taking action from the viewpoint of taking action in the face of fear. Well, this week I want to continue to explore this idea of taking action because truthfully, and you all know this, you've probably experienced this, that taking action, especially when it has to do with a big change in our lives, when it has to do with changing a habit or a routine that we're really used to, is really difficult. I'll be honest with you and share that, I've launched my coaching business, but it's something that I've actually wanted to do for the last almost 2 years. 2 years is a really long time. I actually have wanted to do something on my own as an entrepreneur for much longer than that, probably for 5 years. And that's a really long time. And so even though I knew that when I was in corporate, that perhaps that wasn't my forever destiny, I stayed. But there's actually nothing wrong with that. That's not a waste of time by any means, because even though I wasn't yet taking action by launching my business, I was definitely in motion. And so that's what I want to talk a little bit about today. This concept of what I mean by motion versus what I mean by action. How are they different? How do they serve you? And so I actually want to borrow from James Clear. He's an author that I'm currently reading, whose book I'm currently reading. I'm reading his book called Atomic Habits. And he describes these two terms in the following way. He talks about motion as being movement, right? When you're in motion, you're moving. You're likely strategizing. You're likely ideating. You're planning. You're preparing. You're dreaming. You're envisioning. And that's an important part of the action that you're going to take. But just like a wheel that is in motion, you're in a circle and you're going in a circular motion. And so what that means is that you're not producing an outcome just yet. For example, my husband and I, before we moved into a camper, we spent a lot of time doing things like watching YouTube videos. We would visit RV dealerships. We would talk about what would it be like to move into an RV. So we were definitely in motion, but it wasn't until we made the first step of going to the dealership and putting down our down payment that we started to break from that cycle of motion and instead took action. Going to make the down payment is what triggered our camper to be scheduled to be built, and then ultimately to us moving in 5 months later. So, clearly motion is an important part of getting us into action. We obviously weren't going to just go and put a down payment on a camper without dreaming about it and learning about it, right? and researching what that lifestyle would be like. And, the same thing goes with products, right? A product starts as just an idea that goes through a development phase, right? The motion phase. But the problem is that just as products sometimes do, people also sometimes tend to stay, including myself, we sometimes tend to stay in motion for a little bit too long. When I think back, for example, to all the New Years that I have spent planning for the year ahead, dreaming what I was going to accomplish, the weight that I was going to lose, the exercise I was going to do, the books I was going to read, I spent a lot of time in motion. And I can't even really tell you, I don't really recall, did I achieve those resolutions, right? Did I take those actions? I don't even remember if I did, probably, but I definitely remember the amount of time that I spent in motion. So why is that, right? Why do we tend to, as human beings, tend to stay in motion where we are moving, but don't move into action fast enough? And a simple explanation for that is fear of failure, right? It's much more comfortable to stay in the dreaming phase and the planning phase where the possibility of succeeding, oh, it feels so good to think about that, right? And it's much easier to stay in that mode than going into the action mode where, you start to, you step you dip your foot in, and that maybe is a little harder than I thought it was going to be. And that might mean that I'm going to fail. But in order for us to gain the outcomes that we want to, we have to figure out when it is time to move and break away from motion and really get into action. So I want to share a little bit about, I want to share a question that was really important to ask myself when I was thinking about leaving my corporate job and really leaving that cycle of motion to get into action. And that question was, how much more will I gain by staying in motion? And there's even a follow-on to that, which is, what can I gain by getting into action? So for me, there came a point where I no longer was gaining very much by staying in motion. A year ago, I was gaining a lot by staying in motion, by not taking action to build my business, because I needed to build some financial stability, right? I needed to build some skills at the time. I needed to figure out what this would look like. So staying in motion was really serving me at the time. But very recently, in the last few months, I no longer was coaching in the way that I wanted to coach. I no longer needed that additional time to build that financial stability. I had built that already. And so I knew that by staying in motion, I was no longer going to gain, but the potential outcome, the potential gains of getting into action were far greater, right? I could really start to build my business. I could really start to attract clients and work with clients and start to make an impact in the way that I wanted to make that. So think about it that way. When you're in motion, it can serve you. It's a good place to be in to a certain extent. It's when that balance or when the weight of action starts to be heavier than motion that you need to start to think about shifting from being in that circular motion to start to move forward and get into action. One other example that I'll just share with you really quickly is at my past company, we used to work as much as possible with this mindset of being okay with experimenting and running prototypes or pilots. And we did this because we knew that we really wouldn't gain that much by spending a lot of time on perfecting an idea that we didn't yet know if it was even what our clients wanted or needed. So the faster that we could get an idea out to the world and test it and get feedback, the better the outcomes would be, because we would know if the idea failed, well, then we know the idea is going to fail and we no longer invest in it. And if it succeeded, then great, we knew to invest more in it. So very quickly, we knew that by getting into action versus staying in motion, we would start to gain more benefit and knowledge than the benefit of just staying in this ideation phase. So now that we've talked about this, when to shift, how to know when to shift from motion into action, I want to share 3 techniques that have served me really well as a coach and personally as well, in breaking from the comfortable motion into action. The very first technique that I'll share with you is number one, keep the action small and keep it as small as it makes sense to you. And that is a way to not allow yourself to fail, right? As a coach, I often ask my clients when we're starting to get into the part of the conversation where they're thinking about what's next. I say, what is the minimum that you can do? What is the maximum that you can do? And what's the in between? What's the middle of the road that you can do? And sometimes they'll pick that, but a lot of times they'll pick the minimum. And that is a perfectly okay, a perfectly fine choice. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with that, because that is what is right for them at the moment. And it actually shows a lot of self-awareness and knowing that that is the way that they're going to succeed in their action. The book that I mentioned earlier, Atomic Habits by James Clear, talks exactly about this, about the fact that we think, and I definitely often think, that in order to achieve great things, we need to take massive action and make these really bold decisions. And while I love the idea of making big, bold decisions, the reality is that that's not always possible, and that's not always the right thing. Instead, sometimes it's really good to just think small and think about the tiny habits that you can start to take on consistently, the tiny actions that you can start to take that are going to expand and grow and really create some consistency, which is so important to success. So that's the first one, keep the action small. It is perfectly fine, and it's great to keep the action small. The second technique that I'll share with you is knowing what you need to stay accountable. And what you are going to need to stay accountable is going to be different than what I need, or than what your partner needs, or your parent needs, or your child needs. Also, I once had a client who told me that she hated the word accountable. It just brought up some emotions for her. And so if that, maybe don't think about it like that. Really think about what is the support that you need in order to follow through on the action that you're taking on. For example, for me, I know that responsibility is my number one strength. I've taken the Clifton Strengths Finder, and I've known for a very long time that responsibility is my number one strength. And I absolutely agree. It really is. And what that means is that I know about myself that when I say I'm going to do something, I'm going to do it, because I feel so misaligned and so wrong when I say I'm going to do something and then I can't follow through, right? I really take that responsibility on my shoulders very seriously. And so for me, telling somebody I'm going to do something, like, for example, saying that I am going to show up at 4 p.m. Central for Thriving Thursdays, and making that a commitment to my email community, is going to mean that I'm going to show up at 4 p.m., right? So that's what works for me. Making it public, sharing with someone what I'm going to do makes me feel very responsible to not disappoint them, disappoint myself. So that's what works for me. For other people, maybe it's creating a timeline, right? Giving yourself permission to stay in motion for a certain amount of time and saying, but by Friday, I'm going to take this action, and maybe even putting it on your calendar or telling somebody else what that timeline is. So think about what that motivator is for you. Think about in the past, what motivators have helped you follow through on the action that you have set for yourself as a goal. So number one, keep the action small. Number two, identify what support you need to follow through. And number three, and this is probably my favorite because it's the one that is the most warm and cozy, is find something about the action that you love, right? And that really is about connecting with your why, connecting with what it is that really inspires you and moves you forward. So for me, when I was in consulting, one of the parts of my job that I haven't been secret about this, one of the parts that I didn't always enjoy was the sales aspect. I was expected to bring in millions of dollars in sales as part of my job, and I did, but it made me run in the other direction. It just was the way that it was. But it was such an important part of my job that I couldn't just not do it. And that is the thing about actions, is that we're not always going to want to take the actions. They're not always going to be perfectly aligned with what we so love and enjoy. But if you can find one thing, at least one thing about it that you enjoy, that kind of gives you a little spring in your step, identify that because it'll make it much easier. So for me, for sales, for instance, I realized that the one thing that I really enjoyed about the sales experience was the people, was connecting to a new teammate or developing a stronger relationship with someone that I already knew through that sales experience. That was, for me, very rewarding. And when I think back, I really strengthened some really important relationships in my life through those long, very difficult, stressful nights preparing to submit a proposal or prepare to present a pitch. So that it was, for me, what I knew in the moment that I needed to cling on to, because that was what was going to push me to go through the action and ultimately succeed with it. So to recap, keep the action small, identify the support that you need, find at least one thing you love. And just remember that both motion and action can serve you, right? Motion helps you ideate, it helps you plan, it helps you strategize, it helps you make sure that your idea is realistic. But action is ultimately what will drive you to the outcome that you desire. And when you move from motion to action is when you start to perceive that the gain of staying in motion is lower than the potential gain of getting into action, right? And ways to get into action, again, are to keep those actions small, to identify what it is that you need as support to follow through. And lastly, find one thing about the action that you love. I'd love to hear your thoughts through comments, whether you're watching the recording. You can also contact me via my Facebook Be The Canvas page or email me at carla@bethecanvas.com. Happy Thriving Thursday to you all. I am so thrilled to continue this series. This series is really allowing me to bring a lot of the ideas that I've had and a lot of the learnings that I've gained, books that I've been reading, and really just share them with you all, to hopefully inspire and hopefully help inspire and encourage you to, in this case, take that one small action that's going to get you close to your dreams and your goals. So I will see you next week on the next Thriving Thursday, which I should add is going to be October 1st. I couldn't believe it when I saw that it was already going to be October. So happy fall, happy rest of the week to you all. I will see you soon. Bye.